Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback.
This is episode 45, and my guest today is Tanisha C. Ford. Tanisha is an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware. She's the author of the book Liberated Threads, Black Women, Style, and the Global Politics of Soul, which narrates the powerful intertwining histories of the Black freedom movement and the rise of the global fashion industry. Tanisha studies social movement history, feminist issues, material culture, popular culture, and entertainment, specifically through the intersections of fashion, beauty, and politics. Her public writing and cultural commentary has been featured in diverse media outlets and publications, including The New York Times, The Root, The New Yorker, Ebony, NPR, and Feministing. She's the co-founder of the innovative material culture pop-up lab called Textures. In our interview, Tanisha and I talk about how the global fashion industry is bound up with the global fight for Black freedom, what critical fashion studies can gain from historians of the African and Asian diasporas, how Tanisha is building infrastructures for younger scholars and creators to produce social justice-oriented art and scholarship, and how Tanisha uses Black art and Black creative genius to imagine new worlds. Thank you so much for being with us.
I'm glad to be with you.
So you're the author of a really fantastic book called Liberated Threads, Black Women, Style, and the Global Politics of Soul. I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about what that book covers.
Well, thank you for calling it a wonderful read. I'm always honored when people think that about my work. Liberated Threads is a book that looks at the intertwining histories of the global fashion industry and the global fight for Black freedom. In particular, I look at how Black women, activists, college students, everyday community women, and famous entertainers incorporated dress and hairstyles into their activist strategies. The book roughly covers the period between 1954 and 1994 and is centered in major cities in the United States, South Africa, and England.
What do you find so compelling about fashion? Because this is a really interesting approach to studying social movements.
Right. So when I was writing the book, one of the main questions that was driving me is, how does this choice that we all make every day about what we're wearing influence or impact society writ large? So just starting off with that, okay, dress allows me to get at the everyday. And for me, that offers a window into the past. So we can think of the clothes we wear as material objects. And as such, there are these artifacts that tell us their own narrative about the past. They can lead us in a variety of different directions, be it through personal ownership, first and secondhand markets, issues related to the supply chain and sustainability. All those things kind of come to life through our clothes. But there's also this emotional side of our clothes. You know, we carry around so much emotional energy in our clothing in ways we don't even realize. So every day when we make that choice to get dressed, we are making a conscious choice to do so, considering a number of different personal and social factors. And so because of that, our clothing often carries around our collective social anxieties over things like race, gender, sexuality, religion, and class. So really the dressed body becomes a space where desire and power meet. And that for me is a really interesting space of historical, but also contemporary analysis.
It seems like there's an increasing, although perhaps still rather small, body of critical work that's looking at fashion and style from this kind of politicized or social movement perspective. And it's really exciting to see that grow. But I know it's also, a still kind of underdeveloped field in the academy, at least. I'm curious what you want to see out of that critical field. Are there directions you'd like to see scholars take this, ways that you want them to build on maybe your own work or the work of people you've been inspired by?
When I went to go write my first book, Liberated Threads, I really looked to see what Africanists were doing because I found that African historians have been doing work related to fashion and dress and power for decades. And so they offered a really great model. So I think in the fields of African history, African studies, Asian history, Asian studies, and even Asian American studies, these are fields that have long seen the value in this type of critical engagement. It's ways to talk about governmental politics, ways to talk about geopolitics, economic concerns. And I think scholars of North American history and studies are really just starting to engage in these fields in ways that other scholars have long been doing. And so I'm excited to see what some of this work is looking like, because some of the people, when I think about the US context in particular, I think of a lot of that scholarship being conducted by or produced by people who have training in apparel design, textile production, etc. But in more recent years, I see historians and performance studies scholars and ethnographers really starting to add their voices to the conversation. So I'm happy to see that there are more of us who are engaging in this work. But I think we also have to, in addition to like finding these new directions in the field, we also have to make the work legible to the academy, but also make the academy understand the value of that work. And so what that means is that we need to build institutional structures in order to support the type of work that we're doing and that we want to see. So I think in this stage of my career post tenure, that's one of the biggest things that I've been concerned with. It's not even just about like what topics I want to produce in my own work, but it's about how can I create a space for the scholars who come after me to be able to do this work and gain tenure and, do all the amazing things professionally that they want to do. So I've been working with Fashion Studies, which is a journal. It's the first open access fashion studies journal. It's actually headquartered at Ryerson University in Canada. And I've also worked to establish my own pop-up material culture lab called Textures. And through Textures, we're trying to show a broad audience the importance of cultural studies, fashion being one form of cultural studies, and using the pop-up format as a way to have people think critically about their things. Like, why are we obsessed with things? Why are we obsessed with smartphones and, laptops and clothing and shoes and handbags? Like, why are we obsessed with these things? And what can studying the obsession help us understand about ourselves as a people, help us understand about resistance and so forth? So really, it's like I want to create an infrastructure so that younger scholars and cultural producers, curators can really produce the types of work that engage questions related to power and gender and race and sexuality and class in really interesting and imaginative ways that perhaps weren't even possible for me when I was in graduate school or in the early stages of my career.
I think this is a really good example of how you bring together your scholarly interests with an interest in art and activism. And it seems like that's a natural braid for all of your kinds of projects. I mean, and you also do a really, I think, good job of making scholarly inquiry accessible to multiple audiences, right? You do a lot of public intellectual work. You do a lot of public writing on everything from Black feminisms to, as you were talking about, the politics of fashion to the prison industrial complex. And you do a really good job of demonstrating how these things are all interwoven with each other. So I'm curious what draws you to that intersection of art, activism, and academia.
Well, it's really my happy space. I mean, it's the work that most reflects the dimensions of my personality. So at my core, I'm a creative soul. Since I was a young girl, I've been a dancer, I've performed with dance companies throughout college and even taught classes as a way to supplement my meager grad student stipend. I was involved in performances and theater and drama, and I even still to this day dance, take classes at Alvin Ailey Studio in New York City. I've been studying samba and Afro-Brazilian dance for the past couple of years. And for me, this is the work that fuels my soul, right? Getting to think creatively and bring that creative energy to my writing. It's the best part about this job. And post tenure, I've had a chance to do more of this work. So it's like, I'm always thinking about how can I use the arts? How can I use the written word to get my community free? And so for me, if I look back at other historical moments, the 1990s, which were a huge influence on me as a young girl, young Black girl coming of age. If I think about the 1970s and just hearing the stories from my parents about the Black arts movement, I've long understood that Black art, Black creative genius is a way for us to imagine a new world. Imagine the world that we want to live in. And so for me, I'm constantly trying to think about how I can use my own Black girl creativity to contribute to not only the conversations we're having, but to the ways that we think about enacting social change. So I love partnering with community organizations to think about the connections between the kind of academic or intellectual questions I'm asking and my own creative interests and their own strategies for social justice in the community. And it's the work, like I said, that I find most fulfilling. And so that's why I was happy to collaborate with my really good friend from graduate school, Siobhan Carter-David, who is a history professor at Southern Connecticut State University, and Brandy Thompson-Summers, who's a sociologist at Virginia Commonwealth University, to form Textures. Because for us, Textures it's a way to think about those layers. It's a way to think about how art and activism and scholarly thinking and engagement come together in a way that just makes sense. And instead of thinking about ways to flatten out those intersections or that braiding that you mentioned, we can think of ways to see how those things build upon one another, how they each have their own texture, their own feel, but collectively they do something innovative for us, as thinkers, as intellectuals, as creatives, as curators. And so I'm excited to see where we can go with that. And so as I think about who I want to be in the world as a scholar, as a mentor, as an activist, I think about the people who offer models for me about what this could look like. And so for one of those people is definitely Deb Willis at NYU. She offers a great model for what I want my post-tenure life to look like, all the great work she does with Black portraitures. She really helps me imagine what my contributions could look like, both to the academy, but also in the spaces, the very important spaces beyond the academy, the spaces that we as Black folks, as trans folks of color, gender nonconforming folks of color, differently abled folks of color, these spaces that we have to engage in every day that are so socially violent, emotionally violent, how we can use culture as a way to think about our engagement and our impact in those spaces as well as the spaces of the academy.
Do you have any words of wisdom for folks who are interested in exploring these intersections or maybe integrating areas of their life that they previously haven't braided together?
Well, I think my best piece of advice would be to be bold. And that might seem like something that's irresponsible to say in this job market today, where we see people struggling to gain adequate employment that comes with a living wage, with health insurance. We're seeing how the academy is becoming more and more dependent upon contingent labor that it often exploits. But I still think that this is the best way to approach doing any type of work you do, whether you want to become a professor, or whether your goal is to be an archivist or to be a curator or to be a public historian and work in museum spaces and historical societies. I think the key really is to be bold. At the University of Delaware, we have a PhD initiative in African American public humanities. And the goal of the initiative was to rethink what graduate education should look like, so that we're not just training graduate students to imagine a career in the academy like the careers we chose, but we're training them to do all sorts of other careers that are related to African American public humanities. And this is what I tell the students that I mentor all the time. You really have to be bold and be true to yourself as a thinker, as a creative. Create the project that resonates most in your own spirit, but that has those sound methods that whatever field you see yourself going into, that field can recognize. And while you're doing that, you're forming networks with like minds and with those who have institutional power in the spaces that you want to be. But it's that bold thinking that allows you to give the world something new. And that's what we need. We need innovative thinkers. We need creative thinkers. We need bold thinkers, people who don't want to have to color in the lines. And so those are the types of students that I love working with, the students who already see that vision and really want to move in the direction. So I'm really grateful to my mentors at Indiana University who allowed me to do just that. They allowed me to be bold in my work. So I want to inspire other people to be bold.
It seems like one of the kind of key ways you do that is to write for multiple audiences. You obviously produce scholarship for scholarly colleagues, for other academics or folks who are interested in reading academic work. But you also, as I mentioned before, write quite a bit of public writing. And I'm curious how you have learned to adapt your voice, or maybe the tone that you employ for these different audiences who are seeking different things from what they're reading.
So when I wrote the introduction, or no, it wasn't even the introduction, it was actually the acknowledgments to Liberated Threads, I began by thanking my parents, because they gave me this education on Black feminism, on fashion, on Black music, on the 60s and 70s, long before I ever went to college. And so because of that, I'm always thinking beyond the space of the academy. My natural conversation partners aren't just other people with PhD behind their name. It's the everyday people that I grew up with. It's the people in the communities that helped to shape me. And it's those communities that shaped me more than, I would even say, the academic space. So because of that, I always see myself as wanting to stay connected, grounded in, inspired by, and learning from those communities. So I want to always write things where I can engage with these multiple audiences. I love thinking with my colleagues. I love going to academic conferences and engaging with people. I love writing books for academic presses, but I also love writing for public audiences as well, and not just writing for them, but engaging with them. So I find that when I write public pieces, that you kind of get this instantaneous response from people. And you can even see how your thoughts generate other thoughts among different groups of people who engage with the work, and how then those conversations inspire your thinking. So I think that public writing is a way to really have this instantaneous engagement with our ideas. And the ideas don't necessarily have to be fully formed, and ready for peer review before you introduce them to the world. Now, as you mentioned, the challenge of that, though, is finding the right pitch, first and foremost, for various publications. So that means developing relationships with the editors at the publications to know what they're looking for. What kinds of pieces are they looking to publish in their online magazine or in their blog at that given moment? And then that helps you figure out how to pitch to them, like how to create a story that their readership would want and that they want to publish at that moment. And then I think related to that is that you have to understand then what kind of language that audience is familiar with and that they're used to using. And so in this way, when I say language, I'm not talking about 2-syllable words versus 5-syllable words. I'm talking about a cultural and political language. If you come introducing ideas like intersectionality or misogynoir, would that audience know those terms? How could you communicate those ideas in a way that's equally engaging, but that is not so caught up in the jargon of it all? And it's a skill. And to be honest with you, I'm still learning how to develop that skill. And so it's one of my personal goals to learn how to write in as many voices as possible. And I think the closer I get to doing that, the more I start to see myself as a writer and not just as a scholar.
What are you working on now? Sounds like you got a lot of fun projects cooking.
Well, you know me, I always have my hand in multiple things. I think it's just part of the way that I'm wired. So I'm working on a couple of book projects. The first is one that's under contract and actually due sooner than I probably am ready for, but it's a book that's on fashion and appropriation. So I'm using a Black Power to Black Lives Matter temporal framing to talk about why appropriation hurts, why it's a problem. Oftentimes when we think about appropriation, we're using a model of theft, and we're thinking about the response that people have to having something stolen from them. But this book, the aim of it is to help us rethink how we're defining appropriation by understanding the histories and the relationships, especially the emotional relationships that people of African descent have had with their clothing, and how those relationships have shaped and informed what we have come to understand as some of the most salient political and cultural issues and moments of the late 20th and early 20th century. So I'm working on that. I'm also doing some archival research for a book on Black women activist socialites who are the main fundraisers for the Black freedom struggle. As I mentioned, I'm doing a lot of work with textures. We're really trying to get that off the ground. We've established a social media presence on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Textures MC Lab. We're also with that scheduling different pop-ups where we pop up in spaces where Blackness oftentimes isn't expected, like at museums and in other public forums and events, to speak with the curators, to ask the tough questions about, how they've curated certain things as it relates to Blackness or where Blackness is absent. I'm also on the planning committee for a material culture conference at Dillard University. It's going to be huge. It's one of the first conferences of its kind, and it's really great to have that conversation at an HBCU, and especially Dillard in particular, with its very unique location in New Orleans, which allows us to have a variety of conversations about Black people and our engagement with the material world, the built environment. And I'm also, lastly, doing some work with Kwame Brathwaite Photography to really archive the history and the legacy of photographer Kwame Brathwaite, who was part of a collective that coined the term Black is Beautiful. So we want to bring his photography, but also the intellectual and political philosophy of the African Jazz Art Society and Studios to a broader audience.
So this brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask guests, and in many ways your work is exemplary of this, which is that world that you're working towards when you do all these projects, when you create whatever it is that you create in the universe, when you bring together all of these interests in social justice work, in art, in scholarly inquiry, that world that you want to bring into being in the present. So this is a big question. Some people find it a scary question, but I think it's a really important question that we don't ask each other enough and we don't get enough chances to answer. So I'll ask you, what's that world that you're working towards? What kind of world do you want?
Well, first and foremost, I want a world where my loved ones can make it home safely at night, where I don't have to worry that they will be assaulted, arrested, unfairly jailed, murdered by agents of the state, by vigilantes, by people who have a fear of Black bodies, of trans bodies, of gender nonconforming bodies, of differently abled bodies. That's my first and foremost goal, because embedded in that goal is the idea that we as a global society recognize each other's humanity, that we see each other as humans, as beings who have loved ones, who are attached to communities, who have dreams and goals and visions and talents. And I think far too often that's not how people on the margins and the margins of the margins of this society are seen. And so for me, my life's work is really invested in that. It's that so we can be safe and be free to love, free to create, free to imagine the world that we want to live in. And so that's why I believe that this is really an important question that does really get straight to the heart of what motivates me, of what drives my work. And I won't be satisfied until I either see that world or know that I have planted enough good seeds in the earth that those who come after me will see that world.
Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your vision of imagining otherwise.
Thank you for having me, Kathy. It's definitely a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, Alexander Sastre, and myself, Kathy Hanneback. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about the fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.